That being said, we're going to move on here to another tragic conflict that, well, it's either escalating or coming to a close. I don't know. You never know. There's different reporting every day, and that's the war in Ukraine. There's some interesting new peace initiatives coming out, and also some interesting new war initiatives. And we are very honored to be joined here as we sort through all of this by Vijay Prashad, who, amongst many other superlatives, is the executive director of the Tricontinental Institute. Vijay, as always, thanks so much for being with us here. Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
I seem to do this a lot, but it was a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be with you, but also to follow John and that report on the situation in Gaza. Very important report. So thanks for putting me right after him.
Yeah, well, listen, it's like a baseball lineup. We put our heavy hitters here towards the end so we can make sure to have our viewers be very rewarded. Vijay, there's an interesting sort of dichotomy here. I mean, on the one hand, you have this interesting new peace initiative from China and Brazil, sort of counterposed to this Swiss peace initiative. But so, that looks like perhaps hopeful. But on the other hand, you have this discourse that's growing in America and Europe to try to allow the use of more weapons to strike deeper into Russia, which at least allegedly the U.S. had been preventing. So, I mean, does it feel like we're perhaps on the precipice of something new in terms of the peace process with other forces getting involved, and that's why there's this desperate struggle to escalate the war right here at this moment that Ukraine seems to be losing pretty badly?
Well, I think here a timeline is useful. In February, the Chinese government released a very interesting 12-point peace principles. It's not really a peace plan, it was a set of principles which included things like stability for grain exports from Russia and Ukraine, which included a ceasefire, of course, which included exchange of prisoners of war and so on. A normal peace principles document, which could have then been the basis for a discussion, whether bilateral or multilateral. Bilateral meaning the Russians and the Ukrainians sit down and talk through these principles, which they would have to agree to in advance, or multilateral, bring a few other actors in, and so on. It could have been the basis for quite a useful dialogue, China being an important power in the world. This is February of 2024. There's also this terrible conflict happening in Gaza against the Palestinians. The International Court of Justice was looking at the question of genocide. At the time, it would have been perfect if the sober major countries in the world said to the Russians and the Ukrainians, would you in advance sign on to this and come and sit down, maybe in Switzerland, formally neutral country. Let's emphasize that used to be neutral, no longer neutral because it's taken the side of Ukraine in this conflict. Okay, that was in February. Now, the Russian forces, as the spring entered, that region, Russian forces started to make gains toward the west of Donetsk, expanding the line towards the various industrial cities, which have actually a majority Ukrainian population. Of them, Krasnovik is one of the most important and largest ones. But then Russia did something interesting. They started a northern offense, again, coming in from the north into Kharkiv, into Sumy, and so on, putting pressure on Ukrainian forces, which had been, in a sense, without reinforcements that they needed, particularly ammunition. So the Ukrainians started to pull troops away from the Donetsk border and move them up to the north. It looked like the Russians were going to make some major breakthroughs on the line. Again, a good place to freeze the conflict when you look like you're going to lose and come to the table. But no, this is exactly where the US administration of Joe Biden and sections of the US Congress, led by the Speaker of the House, who was under pressure from the right wing Republicans not to allow more funding to go to Ukraine, they made a deal and in April passed a bill for $95 billion, $61 billion of those dollars to go to Ukraine, the rest to Israel and to Taiwan. This deal of the money, 61 million to Ukraine, plus statements saying, for instance, we're going to give you the most advanced bombers, There may even be the possibility of medium range missiles and so on. All of this inflamed the situation. At that point, in a few weeks ago in May, Vladimir Putin of Russia, president of Russia, went to China, met with Xi Jinping. Again, they discussed the situation in Ukraine. Now, it's important so people don't misunderstand this, that Russia and China don't have a military agreement. In other words, China is under no military obligation to come to Russia's defense. They have two kinds of agreements. One is a security agreement, and the other one is a so called no limits partnership that they signed just weeks before this war began in 2022. But again, when Putin arrived in Beijing, Xi Jinping walked down the stairs to go and greet him. It's an enormous step to show the closeness between Russia and China. Trade between these two countries has gone up to about 240 billion annually, and most of that trade is conducted in renminbi, not in dollars. They are beginning, in a sense, to de-dollarize their bilateral trade. This is important. So the Chinese are eager to have a deal in this war. They think this war has gone long enough, must be shut down before it intensifies, both at the Ukrainian front and at the Taiwan front. They are concerned that this will inflame at both ends. So they want to be part of the debate and discussion. Unfortunately, this money from the United States is really undermining the peace debate and even the so called peace discussions to be held in Switzerland. And it's not clear whether China will go for that. Russia has not been invited. This is a facade. This is not exactly a real bilateral discussion between the Russians and the Ukrainians. It's a real facade, Eugene. I don't hold out any prospects for peace coming out of Switzerland.
And, speaking of holding prospects for peace coming out, it's just how are you going to hold peace talks and not include one of the warring parties, Russia? And, Vijay, this reminds me of what they used to do during Syria, where they would hold these talks in Geneva and oftentimes wouldn't even bother inviting anybody from the Syrian government, which was one of the parties involved in the war they were claiming to try to negotiate for. It's just a complete farce to negotiate in that way. But then the question becomes, as we enter an era where we see the US increasingly and what it represents increasingly isolated and a lot of the world just like not taking it so seriously, particularly when it comes to peacemaking. And then you see other countries like China increasingly stepping in, at least in some ways, right? They've brokered peace deals between Saudi Arabia and Iran, for example, which has played a huge role in helping keep the region stable during a time when, war technically should be exploding everywhere. And now you have a country like Brazil stepping in to want to do a potential peace deal with the Ukrainians and the Russians. I mean, what does this say about the future of diplomacy and where the desire for actual peace and stability lies in the world when the most powerful countries that claim to represent the international civilized order are obstacles to peace and everybody else is trying really hard to make stability possible?
Well, firstly, for the last decade, we've seen this construction of the alternative government scenario. So, you talked about Syria. In the various rounds of negotiations in Istanbul, in Berlin, and so on, they did have a Syrian government actually come and discuss, but it wasn't the Syrian government from Damascus. It was the Muslim Brotherhood group that was from Istanbul that would be there representing Syria. In the same way, they constructed the government of Juan Guaido of Venezuela, and they were negotiating with what they said is the Venezuelans, but in fact, it's a Potemkin Venezuelan government, a fake Venezuelan government. There was a fake Syrian government. I'm surprised that we don't have a Juan Guaido or Juan Guaidowski showing up in Switzerland to
Don't
basically
give them any idea.
represent Russia in this, because that's one of their strategies in the last decade has been to construct a kind of pretend government and negotiate with that government and ignore the government in power. Whether the government in power is one that has majority support or not, they are the government in power. That's the nature of statecraft. is you got to take it seriously. But the West has tried out this strategy of sort of inventing a government. So that's one. I don't think they have the time to invent a Russian government to bring it to Switzerland, but that's one of their old strategies. In this case, it's obvious that this is not about bringing peace to the conflict. It's about reinforcing support for Ukraine, and this is the reason why the Ukrainian president, Mr. Zelensky, is so eager that Joe Biden come to Switzerland. Mr. Biden is not presently planned to go to Switzerland, largely because, well, he's in the middle of an election campaign which he may not win. So he has not been planning to go to Switzerland for the June meeting. It was understood that his Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, would represent the United States, but Mr. Zelensky wants, Mr. Biden has made it clear he wants him there because that would provide what the Switzerland meeting is all about. And it's all about really reinforcing support for Ukraine. And this is the reason why the Chinese are not, right now saying they are going to Switzerland. They don't want to go to Switzerland because they don't want to go to a meeting which is not about peace, but is about standing with Ukraine to continue the war. The Brazilian situation is interesting. The Brazilians have put something on the table in the same way as Lula early on in the conflict in Gaza said Brazil is willing to mediate. But unfortunately, none of the sides to the party have taken the Brazilians totally seriously. What would be very interesting is if Brazil, China, and India come to the table with a united, a proposal. I'm leaving out South Africa because South Africa is in the middle of a contentious election. Looks like the government of the South African alliance of the ANC, the Communist Party, and the trade union movement, COSATU, won't go above 50%. Looks like that now. Don't know what's going to happen, but at least India, China, and Brazil could put a proposal on the table and set up the agenda to hold their own meeting and invite the Ukrainians and the Russians. That could be interesting. That is not being done. I mean, to my own frustration, still the Chinese are allowing the West to set the terms for the discussion, the false discussion about peace, because they're not really looking for a peace proposal here or a peace, negotiation for peace. So they need to call for a meeting at another address, not Switzerland, not Germany, none of these places. It would be interesting to actually take the discussion to Istanbul, which is both in NATO and in Asia, and also had hosted the first peace discussions between Russia and Ukraine in February of 2022. Days after the war began, the Turks hosted a discussion between the Russians and Ukrainians. I don't see why India, Brazil, and China don't call for a meeting in Istanbul, let's say in July, based on the 12 principles articulated by the Chinese, and see if the Ukrainians will adhere to it. That could be very interesting.
Well, Vijay, always thought provoking. You've led me now here to a final question. It's a little bit of a tangent, but it speaks to this overall issue, I think, is what is the possibility here for the revival of the Russia, India, China format? I mean, all three countries have been put up against the wall in many ways by the United States and are together a powerful counterweight. I know there's been some discussion of this, but how likely do you think that could be?
You see, again, this year is the year of elections, Eugene. And, even though we like to do news in a deeper way, a structural way, looking at the structures in the world, the geostrategic, this, that, and the other, things like elections do interfere with current events. The South African election certainly is interfering with current events. The Indian election, a mammoth election, we are coming close to the end of that election. Within weeks, we'll have an understanding of the result. It looks like, by some indications, that Mr. Modi's government won't be as strong as it was just weeks ago. So, I mean, they are not going to be entering into any big picture discussion right now. I think they are going to also wait till the election result comes out. But certainly, I think nothing big can happen around the Eurasian continent without India, China, and Russia are involved. And if they are involved together, that would be all the better, which is why I would emphasize that sometime after the Indian election result comes out, it is not impossible to see a India, Russia, China conversation, a serious conversation take place before the next BRICS summit, because these three countries have, as you said, come to some kind of alignment regarding at least the war in Ukraine. It's very interesting that China and India actually have the same position regarding the war in Gaza. There is no gap. Despite the closeness between Mr. Modi's government and Mr. Netanyahu's government, India has not come out and said, we fully support the Israelis. In fact, India has come out and said two-state solution. That is identical to the Chinese position. It's very interesting, and I think bears mention at the very least.
Well, Vijay, as always, a pleasure to have you with us. Tricontinental Institute is indispensable, so if you're not following them, I hope you already do. Vijay Prashad is their executive director. As always, thanks so much for some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks a lot.